So, we're back, and we're going to join Jean-Paul Sartre here. The essence of man, then, to this existential philosopher, the existential philosopher perhaps par excellence, Sartre, right? The essence of man is his existence. So if you want to know what you're about, you're about your existence. And if we want to borrow from Heidegger, and Sartre read Heidegger extensively, right? It's your being in the world. Okay? You have no predefined nature according to Sartre. Blank slate time. Right? Therefore, the definition of yourself, who you are, right? Who you aspire to be, how you operate in the world, that's your responsibility. Again, we get back to this heavy-duty emphasis on one's own responsibility. Freedom is the essential condition. We're embedded in structures that deny it. And note, Sartre is responding to, these folks are watching the ascendance of Nazi Germany, and they're also watching the ascendance of communism after the Communist Revolution in 1917, 1918. So what we're looking at is these horrible structures, and we can go back to France, you know, under Louis the 14th, 15th, right? These structures that just essentially are enslaving people and robbing them of their freedom, robbing them of their being, designating what they will be, and you know, if you look at American slavery, there's probably no more horrible example in this regard. That is, you rob someone of their ability to choose what it is they do. I mean, that's probably the most destructive thing that can be done to a person. Now, Frankl is going to say, hey, you still choose your attitude about what's being done to you. True, but I mean, huge leap there. So, freedom, then, is your essential condition, but we're embedded into structures that diminish our freedom. Whether it's work, whether it's relationship, whatever it is, right? Interesting, the thing about Sartre and essentially his lifelong partner, Simone de Beauvoir, they never got married because they never wanted this structure of marriage imposed on them. And they both liberally had affairs with other people who interested them throughout their lifespan, right? Because they were not going to allow their freedoms to be diminished through relationship. Extreme behavior, but these are extreme thinkers, right? Now, bad faith is this tremendous term that Sartre comes up with, is the assumption of roles, behaviors, attitudes that are not our own. And he points to a waiter in a Parisian cafe moving about, holding the tray, impeccably dressed, behaving in just this way, but that isn't him. That's the narrative that's imposed upon him. The idea is you will behave this way because we've cast you into the role of the waiter. It isn't him, right? So it's a bad faith narrative. The person is acting out this routine, this repertoire of behaviors at the behest of someone else. So his freedom has been diminished. So anytime you find yourself acting in a way that's not true to you or authentic, if we want to use that term, are you engaging in a bad faith narrative? And the idea then is to introspect and say, why am I participating in this bad faith narrative? Right? So, Simone de Beauvoir, and we've needed to get to her now, she's taking a slightly different angle at this. Certainly, she fully embraces the existential philosophy, but she's going to come at it from an angle that's decidedly feminist, right? Perhaps one of the most important feminists of all time. Relationships are characterized by a difference in power, status, and role. Right? And typically what we see is the males have power, status, right? And then get to take that role, and women are forced into a role of subservience. Sartre would then describe this as a bad faith narrative, right? When women behave as the little woman as they should to fulfill or to conform to the powerful man's narrative. It's a core situational aspect that others did acknowledge to the same extent that Simone de Beauvoir did, right? So she's really looking at the power of the situation. Women are objects of attraction, so they act in bad faith, according to Sartre, because they make themselves up, because that's expectation. So I have to wear this makeup. I can't be attractive without the makeup, right? And it becomes so ingrained, it becomes so much an aspect of culture that it becomes very hard for people to free themselves of it. right? So, the obstacle they're being to the world, their authenticity. So the power structure that's imposed on women, according to Beauvoir, really robs them of their freedom and their ability to behave authentically, to diminish their sense of being in the world. Right? Now, she wrote the seminal work, this amazing book, probably her most famous book, is The Second Sex, seeks to resituate women to men, right, and really explore these power dynamics that are gender-based. So I think she's worth a solid read as well. I've got her on my list, but you guys know there's only so much time, right? Let's talk a little bit about Albert Camus. Now, Albert Camus met Beauvoir and met Sartre, and if you're interested in the history of this, there's another great book. I think it's Blakewell wrote it, but don't quote me. You'll be able to look up the title. The Existentialist Cafe, or some such, charts the history of existential thought, and it's fascinating, and it really makes these people come alive. So not only does it explain existential philosophy nicely, but it talks about the people who are involved. Right? So Albert Camus, I got to read Camus quite a bit in high school. Maybe some of you did as well, both in English and French, because I took a lot of French in high school. I wish I remembered any of it. Right? So let me ask you this. Who goes to high school in Los Angeles and takes French instead of Spanish? Well, there's a bunch of us who did. I never understood, I guess, why I ended up doing that, but that's what happened. So, Camus, right? More philosophical, less psychological than most. Humans are driven to ask the question, what is the meaning of life? And that's really at the core, is trying to determine the meaning. But then he comes back and says, look, here's the deal. And Camus is not a breath of fresh air. He's not someone you're typically going to feel better having read, right? Unfortunately, life has no meaning. There is no imposed meaning on life, right? That is the absurdity. So to Camus, and this leads to kind of this absurd philosophy, and also the theater of the absurd that we see in Europe at this point in time. This is all just bullshit. This is crazy. This is absurd. We behave as if there's meaning, but there's no meaning. We're up to create meaning, so there can be multiple meanings operating simultaneously. Meaning can change. So why the hell are we looking for meaning at all? I mean, Annika, what does life mean? Do you know what life means? She has no clue. She doesn't care. She operates. This is the ultimate being in the world. Annika just is. She bees in the world. That's what she does. Day in, day out. It's us that concern ourselves with all the other crap. Right, sweetie? Makes me kind of jealous of you. Yes, sweetie. So, the myth of Sisyphus, or La Mythe du Sisyphe, if I remember from French correctly, because I got to read this one in both languages, is that story. You piss off the Greek gods and it never goes well for you. Sisyphus pisses off the Greek gods, so they say, hey, here's your deal. See this big-ass round boulder? I want you to push it up that hill. And when it gets up to the top of the hill and you got it up there top of the hill and you wipe your brow and say, wow, that was tough, the shit rolls right back down and you got to go back down the hill and push it back up again, and that is your eternity, is pushing that stone up the hill to watch it roll back down. This explores Camus' notion of absurdity. And notice how a failure to adjust to our life circumstances can make us feel, all right, really recognize the absurdity of life. We got to be able to figure out how to push that rock up the hill and watch it roll down again to push it back up the hill and call that our existence. That is the challenge. To what extent can we accept that and participate in it? So rebellion against limitations and shortcomings, the struggle is when we are our most vital. So that old idea, rage against the machine, that is really the core. Or if we're protesting what we believe to be unfair, or especially when policies are robbing us of our dignity, our ability to understand ourselves, our authenticity, those structures then, to Camus, must be struggled against. And note that Camus is from Algiers, and Algiers was being administered by the French, right? So we watch post-World War II, then Algiers and many countries are no longer being dominated by European countries. So we see a lot of struggle, we see a lot of revolution all over the world. And this is the context in which Camus is operating, right? Many of these guys, kind of supported communism in its early inception, but when they see communism turn to totalitarianism, then in fact they say there's a responsibility to resist against that. So that the conflict, the struggle is where is the result of the meaning that we're trying to create and or trying to live. Now, Hannah Arendt, right? And here's another philosophical mind at the time. And really she's connecting this exploration with the process of birth. Birth being all important, and that we come to be at that moment in time. As we pop out, we're born, and our being in the world essentially begins at that moment. Thinking has come to life again. The cultural treasures of the past, believed to be dead, are being made to exist. There exists a teacher. One can perhaps learn to think. And I think the irony here is the teacher is us. And to the extent that we engage in the phenomenology, to the extent that we seek being in the world to a greater extent, when we seek to find ourselves in terms of authenticity, right, that's the teacher. We are the teacher for ourselves and for each other, right? Action as the realization of freedom is therefore rooted in this natality, this birth, or if you will, rebirth, in the fact that each birth represents a new beginning and the introduction of novelty in the world. So when we take the time and we demonstrate to ourselves our ability to be in the world, it can be as if the world is now newly exposing itself to us. I know. Heavy stuff, and it might be difficult to build an adjustment strategy around this, but maybe not. And if we start thinking in terms of Ellen Langer's ideas of mindfulness, we see that being in the world is a concept that is not all that different necessarily than mindfulness. Yes, there's some definitional differences, but they're mutually supporting. So this role of mindlessness and habit, right, is we're not really choosing all, but responding to tendencies and associations that are beyond the reach of reason and will. And when we talk stimulus-response combinations, when we look at classical conditioning, when we look at learning as a form of habituation, to what extent do we operate mindlessly in our world, not making any choices at all? Those choices were made long ago, and we're just repeating them over and over again in the form of habit. So, existential psychology then and personality. Rollo May, another existential psychologist, if you will. What do we know then? Going to kind of cap it together, kind of summarize it here, if you will. Where the humanists see a goal of self-actualization, and can be demonstrated by a list of B values, if you will, the existentialists ultimately see a goal of authenticity. And authenticity, then, is living in a way that's compatible with one's spiritual, physical, and mental elements. This is me. And I'm going to find a way to become more me as time goes on. That is to be in the world, explore my authenticity, become increasingly authentic, engage less and less in mindless behavior, or as Sartre would put it, start moving out of the bad faith narratives and operating more authentically. Now, it becomes a very difficult path, right? And for many people, they're saying, oh, I don't know how to do that. How the hell? Tell me how to do that. And at that point, we're kind of missing the point, because this is a long-term project. This is a life's work. And you got to ask yourself, are you worth it? And if you believe you're worth it, then you begin this process of introspection according to the existentialists, right? And you define what it is for you to be authentic. Who am I? What is my being in the world? And what really represents me? So existentialism is this continuous exploration. It's never finished. We can always become more authentic, right? It requires constant introspection and constant movement towards this being that I have not yet been, and I am becoming. And to tell you what, moving towards the uncertain is scary, right? So, when one ceases to move forward, that is, gives up on it, I'll just be what other people tell me to be, I'm not really that interested in freedom, I'll just go along, I'll go with the flow, right? Then we get to experience the guilt of living in the past. So that's the emotional correlate here. But as we move ever onward, ever into the future, ever into a state of being that we've not yet been before, that's unknown. And that then causes us anxiety. So ultimately, here it is for you guys. And why existential thought is unpopular to many people is because there's two outcomes. You can feel guilty for not moving forward, that is living in the past, or you can feel anxious for continually moving forward. Hell of a choice, huh? So, and this is where Rollo May, in his book, The Courage to Create, which is much about the creative process, but I think is metaphoric for the creation of the self, which was the opening with Thomas Satz that we discussed. This requires the courage to choose anxiety over guilt. And this is something that resonates with most of the existential psychologists, is we then purposely choose the tough path rather than the easy path. We choose anxiety over guilt. And I'm a big fan of the book Courage to Create, especially for you who are thinking in terms of creative pursuits, which extends to many, many occupational and social domains, right? To be creative means you're doing something that's never been done before. And in all honesty, when we're creative, more often than not, it doesn't work. Creativity usually generates failure before it generates success. So we have to be willing to be creative, to fail, to fail, to fail, and then not know that this time may be in fact the time that succeeds, but willing to do it anyway. So highly creative people kind of at least have implicitly tapped into this notion. So, anxiety and social media, let's bring it up into the 21st century. Our devices employed as a distraction. And, you know, I've kind of floated this idea before that people are distracting themselves from being in the world by being with the device all the time. But Cox offers an opposite explanation in this regard. The desperate, and that his words, the desperate use of devices is behavior in search of connection with something, anything, in an effort to avoid facing the precariousness of their own being. So, to the extent that one's own being represents a threat or the lack of knowledge, right, the device becomes a practical solution to that. But it doesn't solve anything at that point, does it? So, being in the world, right, is the challenge. I'm going to stop here. We've got a couple slides left, but they need to be taken as a whole. And for all this heaviness, and I'm glad and I appreciate you guys sticking with me. We're going to talk about trait theories, and this is going to lead to, I believe, a discussion board assignment. So let's break it here, and we'll go to the next one.